This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 246 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I've said this on the podcast plenty of times, but I don't really use my projections when I'm drafting. Instead, when I'm drafting, I'm using the information that I extract while building those projections. And the difference between those two things is important. When you use projections to draft, you're going with more of a value-based drafting approach. You're not always capturing variance, and you're not always capturing the fact that you're going to be wrong. It's really hard to be so tied to one number, that number being the end projection. When you have more of a loose approach and you're not tied down to what your end projection is saying, you're still utilizing those projections. You're just doing so by remembering specific nuggets that you uncovered when building them. You're finding where value is located. You're more in tune with where volume can be had in situations where volume may be harder to come by. To me, this is why projections are valuable. It's not always about the end number. It's about what goes into that end number. My projections are all set and ready to go, and I'll be changing them throughout the summer based on news items and player injuries. But in the meantime, I wanted to share 10 things that really stood out to me this year when building those initial projections. Before doing so, though, I wanted to send one last reminder about FanDuel's MLB Home Run Challenge. Time is ticking away to enter the free Home Run Challenge contest that runs through May 30th. Just select any 3 hitters to hit home runs, and if your entry has the highest total amount of home runs on the night, you'll win a share of $1,000. Each daily winner will then earn one entry into the $20,000 Home Run Championship, which is on May 31st. For more information, visit FanDuel.com or download the app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. One obvious thing that stood out when building this year's projections was how much opportunity there is for a Green Bay wide receiver to step up. Now, we don't exactly know what this Green Bay offense is going to look like given there's a new regime in place. And we don't have that much history with this regime, or at least head coach Matt LaFleur himself. He was offensive coordinator in 2017 with the Rams, but he wasn't calling plays. He did last year with Tennessee, and they had one of the most run-heavy approaches in the league. But I don't think that we can or should conclude that this means the Packers will be run-heavy. Personnel dictated that for Tennessee last year. And for what it's worth, in LA in 2017, the Rams had a 1.51 neutral script pass-to-rush attempt ratio. That was 6th highest in football. It would make sense for LaFleur to play to Green Bay's strengths, and those strengths are Aaron Rodgers. It's the passing game. So projecting them to have a top half pass-to-rush ratio seems pretty reasonable. That means that there's a decent chunk of volume to go around. And even if they're just an average team in terms of volume, there's still a decent chunk of volume up for grabs in this offense because the only player with a locked-in target share is Davante Adams, period. Geronimo Allison may be the number 2 guy there, maybe. But it's not like Allison can be comfortably projected for 15 to 17% of the team's targets. Jimmy Graham was 5th in the NFL last season in tight end target share, you guys. Jimmy Graham. The dude looked like he was running in glue last year. But he's going to be 33 years old in November, and he's the player who we'd be projecting to have the second largest share in that offense as a receiver. Grandpa Graham. This isn't to say that someone will step up behind Davante Adams, but it is to say that you should throw darts at these guys in case someone does step up. As a team, Green Bay was 6th in wide receiver scoring last year in PPR formats. They were also 6th in 2017. And that's when Aaron Rodgers only played 7 games. And in 2016, they were 1st. This is an offense that will likely score points. And it's one without for sure targets. So throw your darts. Get Geronimo Allison. Get Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Get Equanimeous St. Brown. They're the right type of later round targets to get at wide receiver. Because if one of them really were a locked-in wide receiver 2 for this team, they sure as hell wouldn't be going in the double-digit rounds. Another thing I noticed is that there's a real opportunity for Travis Kelce and Damien Williams to go absolutely ham this year. Let's start with Travis Kelce. Almost 30% of Kansas City's pass attempts went Travis Kelce's way last year. That was by far the highest in the league at tight end. It was also by far the highest share that he had seen in his career. Now, does that mean that we're looking at some regression? I'm honestly not so sure. Last year was the first time that he played a full season with Patrick Mahomes, and the team's other big-time receivers looking at a possible suspension or even the possibility of being cut, that being Tyreek Hill. So I don't think it's that insane to project Kelce for close to the 150 targets that he saw last year. And when you're projecting something like that, it's pretty nuts. Because you're saying this is the average of his range of outcomes. Right now, I have him with over 291 PPR points, which is very close to where he finished last season. And that honestly warrants early round tight end consideration. And you guys know I'm usually not about that life. They're better than mid-round tight ends, but late-round tight end is usually the approach to take given opportunity cost. You can listen to episode 149 for my breakdown on all of that. But know this, understand that the takeaway here is that Travis Kelce does seem to be a worthy early round pick. He could go nuts this year. Now let's move on to Damien Williams on that same team. The reason I say that Williams could go nuts this year isn't because you're projecting him to go nuts. It's that you recognize that a projection for Williams is naturally going to be a little bit conservative. We just don't know exactly what will happen to a 27-year-old running back who only flashed as a super relevant fantasy asset for a chunk of last season. The thing is, though, during that chunk, he was a legitimate RB1. Last season, Damien Williams started 5 games when you count the playoffs. In those 5 games, he totaled a very nice 69 rushing attempts. The Chiefs overall during that time had 108 rush attempts. So he saw 64% of the team's overall rush attempts. If you give him that type of rushing share in a projection, he'll go bonkers. That's a lot of touches on the ground. But with Carlos Hyde there, it's unlikely that he sees that much. But even at about a 40% share, you're looking at 150 plus attempts. At 50%, which is not unlikely at all, you're inching towards 200 attempts. Now, we see 200 attempts from running backs all the time, but when you combine that with a lack of weapons in the passing game in Kansas City this season, you can start to see that Williams has a really crazy ceiling. I have him projected for about 190 carries and 57 targets, and because of the offense that he's in, that makes him at least a mid-range RB2. Now imagine a world where he ends up being more of a workhorse. If that happens, watch out. I actually talked about this in the last mailbag episode that I did, but I have concerns over Sony Michel's receiving workload. New England will utilize their running backs out of the backfield as receivers. We know that. But so much of that receiving volume is likely to go to James White. I mean, that absolutely happened last season, and Michel took a hit as a result. He saw just 3 total targets in their 3 playoff games, and he had just 11 in the regular season. A full healthy season and a rookie year under his belt will help out in that department. And he's going to see the most early down work on that team. That's going to put him on the field a lot, and that naturally will lead to at least some targets. But I'm having a hard time seeing how he finishes as an RB1 this year without a crazy high touchdown total. Now that's certainly possible, but it's not something that you can project or should project. If I'm drafting an RB2, I want the upside that he can become a legit RB1. And I don't know if that exists with Sony Michel given James White's role in that offense. I think Michel is properly priced right now, but I'm not sure how much I'll have of him in PPR formats this year when Damien Williams can be drafted at the same cost. And when I'm not looking at those players likely as my RB1, I'd rather swing for the fences in that RB2 spot. One of the obvious reasons to not rely solely on projections when you're drafting is that projections don't tell you a story. There are a ton of ways that things can play out for a team each year, and projections don't tell you what those things are. Maybe this doesn't make any sense, so let's just use an example. The Rams. You've got Todd Gurley in the backfield who's going to see X projection. He'll see some sort of projection. But we know there's a lot of variance to that projection because we have no idea what his health will look like. We know that he can be the RB1 in fantasy football. But we also know that he could split a backfield. And the person that he'd split a backfield with is Darrell Henderson. You heard Graham Barfield talk up Henderson on last week's show, so you should feel pretty good about his potential as a player. But also the landing spot was really good for his skill set since he's sort of a do-it-all back. But a projection isn't going to show that necessarily. It won't show what Henderson's ceiling really is, which is pretty damn high if things are really wrong with Todd Gurley. And we have plenty of reason to believe there's something significant going on with Todd Gurley. I don't think Henderson will take on a role like Gurley had, especially given his college workload, but it'll be more substantial than if he's sharing a backfield with Todd Gurley. That's for sure. So with Henderson, he's the type of player that you sort of just have to throw out the projection and draft strictly for ceiling. I do think he's in that bucket of players where you may have flex appeal some weeks, even with a healthy Todd Gurley, but then the upside is that something happens to Gurley and he takes on a bigger role. So he's not just a handcuff. He's a handcuff who also has standalone value. But he's surely not going to come out looking amazing in projections, even though he should be someone to target this season. Or at least he should be someone to target right now. San Francisco is a mess to project. The only player you can really feel confident with is George Kittle, and that's really it. But here's the thing. San Francisco could very easily finish as a top half offense in the league this year. It's hard to take anything away from last year without Jimmy Garoppolo, aside from the fact that Kyle Shanahan knows what he's doing. San Francisco wide receivers didn't score all that well fantasy point-wise last year, but they also didn't have much at the position. And they certainly didn't have reliable quarterback play. But George Kittle did his thing, and with such a bad situation last year, San Francisco running backs finished 3rd in rushing yards and 10th in receiving yards. The reason they were 15th in overall scoring at the position was because they scored a combined 9 touchdowns. But based on their rushing and receiving yard totals, they should have had closer to 19. That was the largest difference between actual touchdowns and should have had touchdowns in the NFL, among any team running back group. That's why I'm intrigued by this backfield. All of the players in it, so Matt Breida, Tevin Coleman, and Jerick McKinnon, they're all inexpensive draft picks. If one emerges in any way, though, there's a chance that they become really useful in fantasy football and far outperform their ADP. That's the type of risk reward that you want to target in the middle and late rounds of your draft. So I'll more than likely be more interested in the running backs on that team than the wide receivers, simply because there seems to be a little bit more upside when you consider cost. The Chargers' target distribution is really interesting. Last season, the team's running backs saw a near 10% uptick in target share versus where they were in the previous 2 seasons. Meanwhile, their tight end share dropped by over 5% year over year, so from 2017 to 2018, and then it dropped by nearly 10% compared to 2016. And that brings forth a real issue. What happens with a healthy Hunter Henry? Do we see that running back target distribution fall dramatically? Or do things remain the same for running backs and Hunter Henry suffers as a result? I think it's a little bit of both, but I tend to think that this should make us view Melvin Gordon differently more than anything else. Mostly because we don't really have a consensus viewpoint on Hunter Henry. Tyrell Williams being gone helps in some way, but I'd be surprised if Melvin Gordon sees the same type of receiving workload that he did last year. Honestly, not only because of Hunter Henry's return, but because of health concerns. So right now I have Melvin Gordon at 70 targets. That's how things looked after inputting his target share. So he'll still see plenty of volume through the air, but he had 66 targets in 12 games last year. He's not likely to have the same type of impact as he did in 2018 when he was healthy. And to this point, with Hunter Henry back and with the running backs demanding a decent share in that passing attack, that may also end up capping Mike Williams' upside. Keenan Allen is going to command a lot of targets. I've got him for about 141. And when you break it all down with Melvin Gordon, Austin Eckler, Hunter Henry, and the fact that LA won't throw the ball a ton compared to other teams, that leaves me worried about Williams. Right now, he's listed at just 90 targets, and I think people out there are expecting more from him now that Tyrell Williams is out of the picture. And Mike Williams also has touchdown regression heading his way. Last year, he scored 10 times on 66 targets. His touchdowns to target rate was 15%. Since 2011, we've seen 25 players with a touchdown to target rate at or above 10%, with a minimum of 30 targets who also saw 30 targets the following season. Now, 30 is arbitrary here, but you can't measure something like this with like 10 targets because your touchdown to target rates will be all over the place. But basically, we've had 25 players with some sort of volume in one season who saw a 10% touchdown to target rate, who then also saw some sort of volume the following season. In that following season, so in the N+1 year, only one of those players was able to see a higher touchdown to target rate. That was James Jones in 2011 and 2012. So 96% of the players in our sample ended up scoring touchdowns at a lower rate, and the average drop in scoring among this group was 7%. The way a player like this maintains his fantasy scoring then is with more volume, and Williams will almost definitely get that. He only saw 66 targets last year. But the question is, how much more volume will he see? Because he'll need to see a good bit more to take his fantasy value to the next level. And given what I just talked about, I'm not as optimistic as some that he's a lock to see 100 targets. The Chargers' target distribution is definitely something to monitor as we get into the summer months. I know AJ Green has burned you. He's played a full 16 games in just 2 of his last 5 seasons. He's going to be 31 years old this year. But it's very, very hard to look at an AJ Green projection and not see that he's a screaming value. According to Draft's ADP data, Green's currently the 13th wide receiver falling off draft boards. And on average, it's happening at pick 36. So AJ Green's basically being selected at the round 3 to round 4 turn. I don't think this ADP is unfair necessarily. I just think that he's a great value. Over the last 2 seasons, AJ Green's missed 7 games. 6 games if you discount the fantasy football worthless week 17. So of a possible 30 games, or weeks 1 through 16, AJ Green has played 24. Despite this fact, over the last 2 seasons, Green has 14 top 24 performances, or wide receiver 2 performances. That's the 13th best number in the NFL. and only 15 players have more top 12 performances. Basically, what this is telling us is that AJ Green, when he's on the field, he's going to give you wide receiver 1 numbers. And that's why a projection will look at AJ Green favorably. Mine right now have him as a low-end wide receiver 1. In some drafts, you'll get him behind Amari Cooper and sometimes Stephon Diggs. And then according to drafts, since the NFL draft concluded, you've got Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, Sony Michel, and Patrick Mahomes going ahead of AJ Green too. I understand the need for running back early, and that skews overall ADP. But there are a handful of players that I'd be drafting after AJ Green who are currently going ahead of AJ Green. And running through and building my projections really helped me see that clearly. Washington is sadness. After building out projections, there's really no one that I want from that offense this year when you consider cost. You've got a rookie quarterback throwing to either already proven to be mediocre wide receivers or inexperienced ones, so it's unlikely that the passing game is going to be great. And I don't want to spend my dart throw picks on offenses that are likely to be below average. Give me a Green Bay wideout before a Washington one all day long. Darius Geis is the one player who deserves the most attention on this team. But as I've alluded to all offseason, I still really can't get behind him this year. He's currently being selected as the RB27 on draft, and that's honestly a little bit lower than where I thought he'd be. My projections have him at RB31, so it's not like it's that far off. My fear with Geis is that his ADP is only going to rise. We'll catch glimpses of him in training camp and we'll see that he's good and healthy. And then we're going to hear the coaching staff talk him up. But in instances like this, so many things are working against the player. Like, it wouldn't be shocking to see Darius Geis finish well above his ADP, but we're playing a game of probability here. And what probability is telling us is that he may have a hard time capturing a lot of receiving upside given the quarterback situation and Chris Thompson. And then he may not be 100% healthy. And then he may not even see a typical early down workhorse workload with Adrian Peterson in the backfield. And then his scoring opportunities may be limited because Washington projects to have one of the lower touchdown totals in the league this year. Like, things can hit. Darius Geis can hit. Chris Thompson and Adrian Peterson may not be involved as much. Dwayne Haskins could be awesome. But we can't just simply bank on those things. And to be fair, drafters currently aren't banking on those things. But I have a hard time seeing Darius Geis' ADP going any lower than it is right now without an injury. And because of that, I'll likely not even have much or any of him this year to go along with every other player in Washington. Something else that I talked about on the last mailbag show that I did was how Nick Chubb's ceiling may be a little bit capped by receiving volume. A lot of people want to push him into their top 10, but it's really difficult to do that. The competition at the top of the running back position is stronger than it's been in a while, and most of the running backs that he's going up against at his ADP are going to see a lot more work in the passing game. In fact, I've got Nick Chubb at RB13, and he's a solid 19 targets behind any other running back in the top 12. Projecting target distribution is a puzzle that's based on player history, talent, and the competition on that team. What I've noticed through my years of doing this, and this isn't rocket science, but it's that elite players generally don't see large fluctuations in target share year over year because they're good. They're always going to be fed. So when you introduce one of those players to an offense, the rest of that offense suffers in the targets column. With OBJ in Cleveland, Jarvis Landry sees a decline in targets. David Njoku may not have as much opportunity as he otherwise would. And that trickles down all the way to running backs. There's just so much of a pie that's left over after someone takes a giant piece of it. So that's my big fear with Nick Chubb. I think Chubb is still going to crush it this season. I just don't think that he's as safe as some others are making him out to be based on how my projections work out. The last thing I wanted to talk about today is the idea of available targets. It is really important to look at how teams change year over year and how many targets leave teams. Like, if you're not building out projections, it's a quick and easy way to see where there could be opportunity. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about here. What I want to focus on is taking that idea and then just filling those targets with the best players. Because I think people do that a lot. Kenny Stills comes to mind. It's very, very easy to give Kenny Stills a really high target share in the Dolphins offense. You may look at it and say, who else are they going to throw the ball to? Because you realize that Kenny Stills is the best all-around wide receiver on that team. The problem with that logic is that we've already seen a season where Stills was in a relatively similar situation. And in that season, Kenny Stills didn't see some 20% plus target share. Last year, he was still at a prorated 15 or 16% target share. Considering Doug Baldwin wasn't healthy all of last year, you could almost put Tyler Lockett in this bucket as well. Without Baldwin in the lineup for a few games last season, the percentage of pass attempts that went Lockett's way did go up to about 23%. And Lockett's role in that offense gets an upgrade since he'll be able to find the slot more without Baldwin. I'm not using this to trash Tyler Lockett. He's a very good wide receiver. I'm merely saying that with a banged up Doug Baldwin last year, Tyler Lockett still only had about a 17% target share. So it's really difficult to sit back and be like, the Seahawks no longer have Doug Baldwin, so let's give Tyler Lockett a 25% target share in that offense. He'll get a boost, I don't doubt that, but we also can't overstate what that boost is. This is a really difficult thing to balance, but it's one that's really important when you're building out target shares for players. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And as always, if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. And you can also follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.